Kia ora koto katoa. I want to begin by acknowledging the ancestors of this land, the dispossession of whom forms the basis of this university structure where I sit. I also want to acknowledge the ancestors on your lands, the dispossession of whom forms the basis of those structures that constitute the spaces that you inhabit as listeners, viewers of this conversation. Today, I will talk about my work on the culture-centered approach over the last 2 decades and discuss the ways in which the culture-centered approach, or the CCA, creates spaces for dismantling and transforming structures. In that sense, I will both attend to the practical work of undoing structures as well as the theoretical work that goes into understanding, examining, explaining these structures, as well as working through the communicative processes that constitute the dismantling of these structures. I will begin this conversation by looking at the interplays of structure and power within the context of the neoliberal project, examining the ways in which the inequalities that we live amidst are constituted by the formation of structures. This then will form the basis for the argument for dismantling these structures and looking at the organizing politics of repatriation, the politics of taking back the learning structures, research structures, and most fundamentally, land that has formed the basic infrastructure of knowledge production in the contemporary academe. And in doing so, I will draw upon the CCA as well as the work carried out at the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, or CARE, the center that I direct and that has been working across 13 different countries over the last 9 years. And then I will wrap up with looking at specific instances where communication is mobilized to dismantle and transform structures. Let's begin by looking at an image which most of you are familiar with, an image that makes up the landscape of the spaces that we inhabit in 2021. In the midst of COVID, this landscape is even more evident to us, which is sort of the deep inequality that shapes the organizing of contemporary spaces. So current structures of organizing societies, geographies, economies are built upon the production of inequalities and the circulation of these inequalities to generate profit to serve the expansive needs of global capital. So within this context, the question that I will grapple with in this talk is, how do we build registers for equality and justice? How do we intervene into these structures that work through the production of inequalities? In this image, what you see is part of an urban landscape that is organized to serve the interests of the rich, to serve the interests of the upwardly aspiring classes, and the other part of the landscape that is inhabited by those at the margins, by people negotiating poverty, by people simply struggling to get by. COVID made these inequalities evident across spaces globally, where those sitting in high rises and protected, often secure spaces could quarantine themselves, while large portions of the population, the hyper precarious classes, were thrown into the face of the risks of COVID and continue to struggle with these risks even as we speak. So these structures of marginalization are shaped by what I talk about in my work as extreme neoliberalism, which is the logic of the free market pushed to an extreme where the free market now occupies every realm and form of organizing of human life, all the way from the everyday interactions that we participate in, to our access to preventative services and healthcare, to our access to food and food systems, to our access to places to play, places to enjoy, places to spend our leisure time, to our access to water, air, and natural resources. So this extreme neoliberalism thrives on processes of extraction. So these are the extractive frontiers of capital. And this goes back to the point I began this conversation with, which is the appropriation of indigenous land. So extreme neoliberalism needs to continue to um, capture, steal, occupy, colonize land in order for it to create spaces of profiteering and in order for it to generate capital. So this is the politics of consolidation of power that plays out across global boundaries, that is deeply connected to the stealing of land, to the colonization of knowledge systems, and in that process to the generation of risks that place communities at the margins directly in the face of these risks. So the communities at the margins bear disproportionate burdens of the environmental risks and the climate risks that are direct results of this extreme neoliberalism. This is the form of displacement by dispossession that David Harvey talks about in his work, and that actively works to produce and sustain global inequalities. So people, as they are dispossessed from land, from nature, from ecosystems, are propelled into the networks of exploitation and oppression, into the networks of capital that operate across the globe, particularly at urban sites of global production. So you see large-scale migration and flow of labor into these sites of capitalist production that is organized along the lines of precarity, with limited rights as workers to collectivize into unions, to lay claims into proper working conditions, proper living conditions. And this is played out in the form of increasing the inequalities in the flow of power, in the distribution of power. Between the owners of capital, between the managers of capital, and the workers of capital. So wealth in the hands of transnational elites is enabled by this consolidation of power and is constituted communicatively. That is, that these transnational power inequalities are propped up through systems of communication, which on one hand carry out the kind of neoliberal propaganda that make the market seem the legitimate solution to problems and struggles, and on the other hand, carry out various forms of repression that silence the voices of those at the margins, all the way from attacking unions to creating authoritarian policies that criminalize protest, that criminalize articulation, that challenges the structure of the state organized to facilitate capitalist accumulation. So transnational power inequalities in this sense are also geographical, that draw from the power of the nation state, with the nation state being organized to enable capitalist accumulation. So communication in this sense is a constitutive element in the reproduction of these inequalities. The increasing material marginalization of the poorer sectors of the globe is intertwined with the increasing communicative marginalization of the poorer sectors of the globe. So the neoliberal project thrives on technocracy, reliance on experts to carry out policies and programs, albeit with smart strategies of engagement, where engagement as seduction is designed in order to shape processes of dispossession. So you can have urban redevelopment programs that are actually working to dispossess the poor, use the language of engagement and participation to carry out that process of disenfranchisement. So alongside these processes of technocratic, expertise-driven governance, the processes of smart engagement, we see depletion of democratic possibilities. So this process of depletion is a key characteristic of extreme neoliberalism that we witness across the globe, certainly in my field sites where CARE and I do our work, such as in Singapore, such as in India. We see the rise of authoritarian forces to actually consolidate the power of neoliberal capital. And this is often enabled by the role of the police and the military deploying violence, deploying strategies of disciplining, often through the production of the threat to security to manage the interests of global capital. So what does, within this context, the process of dismantling look like? In the work of the culture-centered approach, I put forth the argument that in order to dismantle these deep inequalities, we need to look at the interplays of communication with the material inequalities, with the idea that communicative inequalities, inequalities in distribution of resources for representation and recognition, are tied to structural inequalities, inequalities in distribution of resources, access to resources, as well as access to policies and programs. So communication then, in this sense, works as a strategy of erasure where the subaltern, those that are at the margins of the margins, the hyper precarious classes, are incorporated through technologies of democratization, participation, engagement to serve the interests of neoliberal capital, serving the ongoing interests of civil society, state, academe, organized to serve the overarching interests of the market. So democracy in that sense is reworked, co-opted, consolidated as engagement to serve capital, while democracy as opportunities for people's participation in everyday forms of life to make decisions that impact their lives are actually depleted on a consistent basis. So to address this process of communication as erasure, the culture-centered approach puts up 5 key points. Drawing from the work of Gayatri Spivak, it then argues, how do we build habits of learning to learn from below? Looking at these habits as ways of reorganizing structures, and more fundamentally, as ways of dismantling those structures that produce erasures. How do we build processes of patient listening to an ethic of the other? And those processes then work toward creating other imaginations outside of the ideology of neoliberalism. And within these processes of listening, we create infrastructures for indigenous sovereignty, for sovereignty of communities, where they can articulate their own right to make decisions that are meaningful to them. And through these processes, we build indigenous stewardship, community stewardship, where communities at the margins become stewards of the environment, stewards of the climate, stewards of food systems and health systems, in order to sustain these systems to serve the needs of all. So these processes of inverting the dominant structures of meaning making then are tied to the work of building communicative equality. And I think of communicative equality in 2 ways. One is in terms of equality in the distribution of resources, and the other is in terms of equality in the ownership of resources. So when we think of resources, we can consider information infrastructures and resources, infrastructures for representation, for decision making, and for the CCA, we are really interested in the question of voice. So infrastructures and resources for voice. So in this one image that you see here, this is from the work of CARE in Jhargram, which is a predominantly indigenous community in the eastern part of India, a site of ongoing struggle between the indigenous community and the organizing structure of the state, particularly against the development operations that are carried out by the state, which become sites of dispossession. This community also had been for about 4 years, around 2011, the site of ongoing indigenous struggle, Maoist violence, and violence deployed by the state. So within this context, this question of ownership of democratic processes of representation, decision making, voice become vital to the work of dismantling the hegemonic structures that perpetuate the material marginalization of indigenous peoples. At the heart of this work of building these communicative infrastructures for voice is the concept of Tinuranga Tiratanga in Kapapa Maori, which reflects the concept of communication sovereignty, where indigenous communities, rural communities, communities at the margins own the communicative infrastructures through which they can raise their voices by participating in ways that are meaningful to them, not by logics that are established by the World Bank, by transnational corporations, or by the state serving the mandate of the bank, but by participating in ways that are configured in logics that are meaningful to community life and that serve the lived experiences of community members. And these community sovereignties, or when communities actually own these communication infrastructures and own the logics of these infrastructures through which they can participate on them. So when we have communication sovereignty, we are able to build the radical democracies in the everyday, where communities can participate in determining what is important to their health, what is threatening to their health, and through that process then creating food distribution systems, spaces for play, spaces for practicing culture that are meaningful to community life. In this work that is reflected in this image, where CARE has worked with the Deccan Development Society, or DDS, which is an organization comprising of multiple sanghams or cooperatives that are run by Dalit, oppressed caste, women farmers, most of whom are landless, who work on taking back agriculture through these processes of communication sovereignty so that they can own the indigenous seeds. They can store them in seed banks and circulate them through logics of care without having to negotiate through the processes and technologies of the market. So these radical democracies in the everyday, and in this case, this is a process of democratizing agriculture, is built upon the women's capacity to tell their stories. So you can see a woman farmer running the video camera, and her ownership of that narrative possibility, that narrative capacity to be able to tell that story is vital to dismantling the structures of neoliberal capital. So voice infrastructures become material interventions. So in this particular context, the voice infrastructure becomes a way for the women to own and create a basis for building a knowledge system grounded in indigenous agriculture that goes back to the concept of Tinuranga Tiratanga. In other contexts, for instance, the work of CARE has transformed into community organizing to resist state-led dispossession of indigenous land. So land occupation becomes a strategy of dismantling the structure enabled through the process of co-creation of these voice infrastructures. Now, when these voice infrastructures are created, it is vital to think through how we sustain them. So the process of sustenance is about asking how do we co-create those logics of sovereignty across communities? How do we identify strategies for creative response, especially when the hegemonic structures, to the extent that they realize and when they realize the transformative capacities of community organizing, clamp down on these spaces, repress these spaces, um, uh, erase, seeking to erase sites of articulation. How then do we build creative strategies of resistance? How do we build plural networks of solidarity, of connecting with each other, of standing by each other, and particularly for academics inhabiting the neoliberal university? How do we interrogate the sort of opportunism that is fostered by the neoliberal university to build habits of solidarity that places our bodies in um, harmony with, working alongside the struggles of communities. And in this context, it really becomes important to strategically figure out ways of timing the processes of building communicative infrastructures and strategies of resistance, of connecting across spaces so that resistance is distributed across spaces, and co-creating multiple nodes of voice so that when structures seek to repress one particular site of voice articulation, there are multiple others that come up at the same time. So creativity is vital to these processes of sustenance. And through these processes of sustenance, then we build infrastructures of listening. Here you see a woman farmer who is working at the radio station, the community radio station that is run and owned by the sanghams. And there, this collective space for voice becomes a site for listening, listening as a way to dismantle the hegemonic structures, as an entry point to imagining alternative political, economic, structural configurations, and as a framework for rendering impure the dominant categories of knowledge that carry out the colonizing mission. I will wrap up with this image. This is an image of the women farmers singing to the seed. And you can see here their work of building this voice infrastructure, where their songs are part of that voice infrastructure, where they narrate the songs of the seed, becomes a way for intervening into hegemonic agriculture. So I wrap up with arguing that communicative infrastructures, particularly infrastructures of voice, are at the heart of dismantling the global structures of neoliberalism. I will let this song play out. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation.